All right, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. The Young Philosophers Lecture Series is a cool thing to be a part of. It's a lot of fun and a great honor to be selected. So I really appreciate you guys having me and coming out. So, as Dr. Cullison mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the cheery subject of the fear of death. And so the question I really want to get at is whether the fear of death is irrational. But there's a couple of things we might mean by that question. So maybe as a way of illustrating the sort of question I'm interested in, I should talk about a different emotion, namely anger. So I'm going to tell you guys a true story. This happened to me a couple of months ago. So my wife is a nurse, and she works at a hospital, and she has those long 12-hour shifts. So she has to work from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. So that means she has to get up really early to go to work and to make it there on time. Usually she gets up around 5:30 or so. It's very early. And I am not a morning person, not at all. If I had my choice, I'd go to bed at 2 or 3 a.m. and get up at 11 a.m. I'm just a born night owl. But I like to get up with her on the days that she goes to work early, that she gets up early, for a couple of reasons. One is, despite the fact that I'm not a big morning person, I find I do my best work in the early morning hours. So once I can, get up, get a few, 3, 4 cups of coffee in me, then I'm good to go to get some good work done. And also, I like to see her and send her off. So a couple of months ago, we were doing this drill. It's 5:30 in the morning, we get up, and I make her a cup of coffee, and I put it in one of those big ceramic coffee mugs that has a to-go lid on it. It's 5:45 in the morning, just keep that in mind. And so I go to hand her the mug of coffee, and she reaches out, but I thought she had it. And right as I let go, she got distracted and looked away. And the cup of coffee, 5:45 in the morning, keep that in mind, falls crashing to the floor. The only problem is my foot is in between the mug and the floor. And this huge cup of coffee in this big, giant, heavy ceramic mug falls square on my toe. 5:45 in the morning. I'm screaming bloody murder. I'm like, my toe is broken. I know the neighbors probably thought something terrible was going on. I'm screaming. And the second thing to go through my mind at 5:45 in the morning, other than the searing pain, and I really did think she broke my toe, was anger. I was so mad and frustrated at my wife. I was like, oh, how could you drop this cup of coffee on my foot at 5:45 in the morning? Now I'm going to have to be limping for, couple of weeks. We're going to have to go to the doctor. I was pitching a little hissy fit in my mind. But I immediately realized, as I'm rolling around on the floor, that my anger was irrational in a sense. It was irrational because I didn't really have anything to be upset with my wife about. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't done anything to merit my anger or my frustration. She wasn't trying to hurt me or spill hot coffee all over me. And she wasn't being negligent. I mean, we were both sort of not paying attention. When I handed her that mug, I wasn't paying attention. She wasn't paying attention. So I couldn't really accuse her of any negligence. So she hadn't done anything that really merited my anger. I really had nothing to be frustrated at her about. So in that sense, my reaction of being frustrated, of being angry, and directing that towards her was irrational because there was nothing about her behavior that merited that emotional response on my behalf. And once I realized this, my anger went away and I went about being a baby and, holding my foot, and crying and trying to get some attention from her. Now, anger isn't the only emotion that can be irrational in this sense. Other emotions can be unfitting or unwarranted as well. And fear seems to be one of those emotions. So here's an example. Consider the tortures of the dentist chair. That seems like something about which we might legitimately be afraid. We've got something to fear from the tortures of the dentist chair, namely the pain that's involved. Right? And so if someone was about to have a root canal and they knew that it was going to hurt, that it was going to be pretty painful, we couldn't really accuse them of having an irrational fear, right? Unless it was like super excessive. But if they just had some mild fear, some mild apprehension about the pain they were going to experience in a few days, we couldn't accuse them of having an irrational fear. Because there is something about the dentist chair that can be frightening, namely the pain involved. Now consider ordinary teddy bears, right? Ordinary teddy bears, seems like we've got nothing to fear from them, right? They're innocuous. So if someone was afraid of an ordinary teddy bear, despite knowing that they had no reason to be afraid of the teddy bear, then we could accuse them of having an irrational fear of teddy bears. And so that's the sense in which I'm interested in the question, is the fear of death irrational? I want to know, is death something about which we have reason to be afraid? This is a pretty interesting question if you think about it, because the fear of death is ubiquitous. It's all over the place, right? Some people are just terrified of dying. And even those of us who don't have a sort of excessive fear of death, still we tend to view the prospect of our own demise with at least some, trepidation, at least some apprehension. So what we want to know is, are we right to fear death? Do we have anything to fear from it? Now, we have to be careful because sometimes when people talk about the fear of death, what they're really talking about is the fear of dying, or the fear of the dying process. And what I mean by that is roughly the series of sort of debilitating and sometimes very painful events that are the immediate precursors or the proximal causes of our actual deaths. Right? And precisely because that process of dying is often unpleasant, is often painful, it seems pretty clear that we might have something to fear from it. But what I'm interested in is the terminus of that sometimes painful process of dying, namely the death itself and the state of being dead into which our death ushers us. Do we have anything to fear from that? Now, the answer to this question would be pretty obvious if we knew that there was going to be some unpleasant experiences in the afterlife. If we knew, for instance, that the fires of hell awaited us, then I think it'd be pretty clear that we might well have something to fear from death, because it's a gateway into this very unpleasant state of being. But let's set that aside, and let's assume, at least for the sake of argument, that death is what it appears to be, namely the permanent cessation of conscious experience. So when you die, there's just nothing, you have an experiential blank. Let's suppose that death involves that sort of thing. And then we wonder, well, do we have anything to fear from it? And now the answer to that question is a lot less obvious, right? Because when you sort of view death as just the end, it kind of, it seems a lot like falling asleep, with the notable exception that you're never going to wake up. And we might ask, well, what could be frightening about that? What could be terrifying about that? And some philosophers have thought, well, nothing at all. There's nothing at all frightening about that sort of thing, about sort of permanently falling asleep. So what I want to do today is I want to look at a particular argument for that conclusion, for the conclusion that we have nothing to fear from death, by the Roman philosopher Lucretius. Now, we don't really know much about Lucretius himself. What we do know is that he was a big follower of another philosopher named Epicurus. And Lucretius wrote a poem, a philosophical poem, in which he defended a number of Epicurean philosophical views. And one of the Epicurean views that he defended was Epicurus' famous claim that death is nothing to us. That's what Epicurus thought. Epicurus thought death was nothing to us, and in On the Nature of Things, Lucretius gives several arguments defending that claim. Now, it's not always clear what Epicurus meant when he said death is nothing to us. So, for instance, some philosophers take him to mean that death is in no way bad for the person who dies. And other philosophers don't think he quite meant anything that strong. But what it is clear that he meant is that death isn't an appropriate object of emotional concern. It's not something we should be stressed out about. It's not something that we should be apprehensive about or that we have reason to fear. And then On the Nature of Things, Lucretius set out to defend that conclusion, that we really don't have anything to be terrified or distressed about when it comes to the prospect of our own death. Now, some of his arguments sort of recapitulate Epicurus' own arguments, but he does offer some novel considerations in favor of the conclusion that we've got nothing to fear from death. And I want to focus on what the most famous of those arguments. It's sometimes known as the symmetry argument. So the symmetry argument has its roots from this the following passage from Lucretius. So Lucretius invites us to look back once more on how past centuries of infinite time prior to our birth have meant nothing to us. This, therefore, nature offers to us as a mirror of the time to come, once we are dead and gone. What appears so horrifying about it? Does anything seem gloomy? Is it not more free of misery than any sleep? What appears to be going on in this passage is Lucretius appears to be inviting us to look back at our pre-vital non-existence and to our period of non-existence before we existed. And he seems to be suggesting that when we do, we'll see that there's an interesting symmetry between that period of non-existence and the period of non-existence that our death is going to lead us to. And he invites us to look at the pre-vital period of non-existence, and he says, look, nothing terrifying about that, right? No one in here is afraid of their pre-vital non-existence. No one's afraid of not existing before we did exist. That's not a terrifying state of affairs. But he says, look, that's just what, you're just going to go back to that state once you die, right? Both experiences are going to be, well, not experiences, right? They're going to be experiential blanks. So if you're not afraid of the experiential blank that preceded your lives, you don't have anything to be afraid about when it comes to the experiential blank that's going to follow your lives. So the picture Lucretius seems to be painting for us looks something like this. Here's your timeline. You've got the span of your life, and before your life, there was a period of non-existence, and then you were born, or if you think you came to being earlier than that, maybe at conception, then there's your conception. And then you've got your life, hopefully for all of us, it's very long and full of many happy years. And then your death, and then you don't exist again. And these periods of non-existence, they're just experiential blanks. Right? And we look at this one, and we say, hey, nothing frightening about that. Wasn't so bad, was it? Well, after you're dead, that's just what your death is going to lead you into. Another period like that. A good, long sleep filled with misery. A permanent sleep filled with no misery, I should say. Right? So this is the picture. And so a lot of philosophers have seen in this sort of reflection from Lucretius an argument for the conclusion that we have nothing to fear from death. So here's a sort of simple reconstruction of the argument. So it starts with the first premise. This is a general claim about things we have reason to fear. So it says, if you have nothing to fear from X, and there is no relevant difference between X and Y, then you have nothing to fear from Y either. Then Lucretius says, hey look, you've got nothing to fear from your pre-vital non-existence. That wasn't so bad. Then he claims, look, there's no relevant difference between your pre-vital non-existence and your post-mortem non-existence. So it's going to follow from these two claims that you've got nothing to fear from post-mortem non-existence. And since death is just the event, presumably painless, that leads you into that period of post-mortem non-existence, you shouldn't have anything to fear from it either. It's not going to lead you into any pain, any suffering. So don't be troubled by it. Let go of the fear of death. This seems to be Lucretius's line of reasoning. Now, the argument appears to be valid. In other words, the premises, if they're true, they support the conclusion. So if there's a problem with Lucretius's argument, it seems like that one of these three premises is going to have to be false. So maybe we can try to see if any of them are. I think the first premise is true. You've got nothing to fear from X, and there's no relevant difference between X and Y, then you've got nothing to fear from Y either. So maybe here's an example to illustrate the plausibility of that claim. Suppose you have two snakes, different species of snakes. And you admit that the one over here, the snake over here, is harmless and you've got nothing to fear from it. Well, if it's true that you've got something to fear from the other snake, then it seems like there has to be some relevant difference between the two snakes. Maybe this snake over here is poisonous, or maybe it's one of those big snakes, right, that can wrap itself around you and asphyxiate you. Right? There has to be some difference. If there's no relevant difference between the two snakes, if they're just two species of harmless garden snakes, then if you've got nothing to fear from the one, it seems like you've got nothing to fear from the other. So this first premise seems pretty plausible, at least at first glance. The second premise also appears pretty plausible. You've got nothing to fear from your pre-vital non-existence. I mean, I think we can agree with Lucretius here. We look back on that period of time prior to our birth, and there doesn't seem to be anything terrifying or frightening about it. So, I think that if there's something wrong with Lucretius's argument, if it's not a good argument, there has to be something wrong with this third premise. In other words, there has to be some relevant difference between our pre-vital non-existence and our post-mortem non-existence. And I'll try to suggest at least two possible differences that might give us reason to fear death. But before I do that, I should say, I don't think anyone plausibly thinks that there's anything about non-existence itself that is frightening or that merits fear. Right? There's no intrinsic feature of the state of non-existing that is frightening or evil or merits fear. What I think we have to say is there's something about the result of our post-mortem non-existence that we might legitimately find frightening. So it's not non-existence itself that we should be worried about, but it should be the consequences of our non-existence. And so a lot of philosophers who think that there's something evil about death or bad about death for the person who dies, they take what is sometimes called the deprivation approach to death. And what they say is, what's so bad about death is not any of its intrinsic features. Rather, it's what it deprives you of. Because when you die, you no longer get to experience any of the good things in life. Right? So death sort of takes those good things away from you. So if you imagine your future and what you aim to do when you leave here today or what you aim to do next week or the good times that you expect to have over the summer or something like that, if, God forbid, you were to pass away before then, your death would deprive you of those experiences. It would deprive you of those good things. And that's what makes death an evil or bad. And the response to Lucretius that I'm going to suggest are at least in line with this deprivation approach. All right, so what possible differences might there be between the period of non-existence that precedes your life and the period of non-existence that follows it that might make the one a suitable object of fear, even though the other is not? Well, I'm going to make two suggestions, and here's the first one. Death, and the period of non-existence in which it's going to usher me, permanently precludes the possibility of my flourishing in the future. Right? So when you die, absent any divine intervention, that's it. Right? You're never going to flourish, you're never going to be well ever again. So your death permanently precludes your ever flourishing again. But notice, your pre-vital non-existence doesn't. Right? Your pre-vital non-existence is consistent with you coming into existence, being born, and living a long and happy and flourishing life. So your pre-vital non-existence doesn't rule out the possibility of your future flourishing, whereas your death and your post-mortem non-existence does. And that seems like it might be relevant, right? So this seems like a plausible principle. If X will permanently prevent you from ever flourishing again, then you've got reason to fear it. Or at least perhaps you could have reason to fear it. And since death falls into that category of things that permanently prevent you from flourishing, this principle would have the consequence that we do have something to fear from death. Now, someone might object to this. They might say, well, look, before you were born, you weren't flourishing. You weren't in a state of well-being. Why should the fact that death permanently prevents you from being in that state matter, right? Why shouldn't it just be the case that your death does prevent you from flourishing? Why doesn't that matter? And then if it did, well, since your pre-vital non-existence prevents you from flourishing too, then it seems like we could be led to the conclusion that we should fear pre-vital non-existence, and that would just seem absurd, right? So, a couple of possible responses to this objection. One possible response is you might very well think that it's the permanence of death. It's the permanent non-existence that really does matter, right? If you knew that you were going to be in a state of suspended animation for 2 years, let's say, but nothing you weren't going to lose any value in your life. You were still going to go ahead and have a good life. You might not really have reason to fear that, even though while you're in a state of suspended animation, you're not going to be flourishing. You couldn't be said to be flourishing in that state. But now, if you were going to permanently lose your life, or permanently lose your consciousness, that seems like perhaps it might make a difference to whether you have reason to be afraid or not. So perhaps the permanence of death really does make a difference. Alternatively, we might say, well, maybe the permanence doesn't matter. Maybe anything that prevents you from flourishing during a certain period of time is bad for you. And maybe if it's bad for you, you've got some reason to be afraid of it. Maybe that's true. But even if it were, it would not give us reason to fear our pre-vital non-existence. And here's why. Fear is what we might think of as an essentially anticipatory attitude. It's directed at future states of affairs. Right? So it's not even clear that it makes sense to say that you could fear some past event or state of affairs. But notice your pre-vital non-existence, it's in the past, and necessarily so, right? It wouldn't be pre-vital, right, if it weren't in the past. So precisely because that state of affairs is in the past, it's not even clear that it would make sense to fear it, or that it would be possible to fear it. But even if it were, I think it still might be irrational. But that needn't be because it's not bad for you, because non-existence isn't bad for you. It might very well be. I mean, just think, if you had been born a century earlier, but were able to live up until even now, just think of all the good things you would have experienced. I mean, you might have had a very good life. So perhaps your pre-vital non-existence has deprived you of some good things, and perhaps in that respect, it's bad for you. Even so, you don't have any reason right now to fear it, because it's in the past, and you shouldn't fear events in the past, right? Even if there's some sense in which they were bad for you. So here's an example. Suppose you underwent a really painful medical procedure last year, and you're going to have another one just like it tomorrow. And you're a little apprehensive, you're nervous because you know it's going to hurt a lot. Now imagine one of your well-meaning, but misinformed friends who's been reading too much Lucretius lately, trying to comfort you like this. Hey, look, you don't have anything to fear from that procedure tomorrow. Just think, it's going to be just like the one you had a year ago. And it would be silly for you right now to be afraid of the procedure you had a year ago. So since they're just alike, you shouldn't be afraid of the one you're going to have tomorrow. It seems pretty clear the mistake your friend is making. The mistake your friend is making is both operations, both procedures, might have been bad for you and might have been suitable objects of fear at the time, right? But now the one is past. That's why you've got no reason right now to be afraid of it. Whereas the procedure you're going to have tomorrow, it can still hurt you, right? It can still affect your well-being. It's still going to be painful for you. And so you might have some reason to be apprehensive about it, even though it's intrinsically identical to the operation that you had a year ago. And in a similar way, people who think that we have reason to fear death might concede that our pre-vital non-existence was in a way bad for us. But they still might say, we don't have any reason right now to fear it because that period of non-existence is over and done with. But our future non-existence is still to come. And since it's going to preclude us from flourishing, we might very well have some reason to be apprehensive about it. All right, so this is one possible difference between post-mortem non-existence and pre-vital non-existence. Let me suggest one other that maybe is a bit more intuitive. Death permanently deprives me of everyone and everything I actually care about, whereas pre-vital non-existence doesn't. Right? So if, God forbid, I were to die today, well, I'd never get to see my wife again. I'd never get to see my best friend again, my brother again. Death would, in a way, steal from me those people. Right? And I suspect for many people who have a fear of death, or sometimes experience a fear of death, or find something sad or distressing about death, it has to do with the fact that they're going to lose the objects of their affection, right? They're going to lose all those things that they really care about. And when we die, our death separates us from our loved ones. But notice our pre-vital non-existence doesn't separate us from them. In fact, in a way, it makes our relationships with them possible. Because if you had been born a lot earlier than you actually were, perhaps you would have never met your best friend, right? Perhaps you would have never met your significant other. And so your pre-vital non-existence, if it had been shorter, right, if you had been born earlier, it might have taken away those relationships that you actually care about. Or it might have prevented you from ever having them in the first place. But now that you actually do have those relationships, you care about them. And death, in a way, causes you to lose them. And that might be a suitable object of apprehension and fear. So one reason you might legitimately fear death is it takes away these objects of your emotional affection. Now, people in the Epicurean tradition might object to this line of reasoning as follows. They might say, you should only fear or be apprehensive about losing things when the loss is somehow going to be painful to you. However, I think this is a mistake, and here's why. When you dread losing something that you care about, what you mainly are distressed about is the loss itself, right? Not the unpleasant feelings that typically accompany such loss. So here's an example. Imagine a man is informed that his wife has been in a terrible accident and that she might die. I think we could all agree that it would be perfectly sensible, perfectly rational if this man feared losing his wife. But I don't think the rationality of his fear turns on whether his wife's passing is going to cause him any pain. So here's a fancy philosopher's example. Suppose a magician tells this man, if your wife does succumb to her injuries, I'm going to cast a spell over you, and it's going to prevent you from experiencing any sadness or any pain at your wife's passing. And he knows this for sure, so he knows he's not going to have any unpleasant experiences, any sadness if his wife dies. Now it seems to me that the man would still be perfectly reasonable if he were apprehensive or anxious or fearful about the possibility of his wife dying, right? Even though it wouldn't result in any pain. So I think we can have reason to fear losing things that we value, even if the loss isn't going to cause us any pain and suffering, right? And so since death deprives us of things that we value, and in particular the relationships that we value, then it might be something that we have reason to fear, even if our pre-vital non-existence isn't. Or isn't something we should fear. All right, so those are two proposed responses to Lucretius. Now I want to close by considering a slightly different question. Should we fear death? And this is a different question from whether we have reason to fear death. Right? And here's how they're different. It might be true that you're better off without the fear of death. You might live a happier, more carefree life if you just sort of put the fear of death aside. And perhaps that was Lucretius's point all along. Perhaps his point was that we've got good reason to get rid of the fear of death, because if we did, our lives would be happier. But it doesn't follow from that we have no reason to fear death. So here's one last example. Imagine Jones is captured by the enemy, and they tell him, tomorrow we're going to start torturing you, and we're going to torture you for 2 days. Right, so that you give us the information. And until then, we're going to put you in your cell. Now, I think it's clear that Jones has something to fear from his impending torture. It would be perfectly rational for him to fear his impending anguish. But nevertheless, it might be true that he would be a happier person if he could rid himself of that fear. Maybe he could hypnotize himself, right, and just try to do away with his fear of his pain. So he might be better off without the fear. But it's still true that he has something to fear from his impending anguish. And likewise, perhaps we can agree with Lucretius that we would be better off if we could rid ourselves of the fear of death. We'd live happier, better lives. But it doesn't follow from that we have absolutely nothing to fear from death. And I've suggested perhaps 2 reasons why we might find the fear of death a legitimate or a fitting fear. So what attitude should we take towards death? Well, it's not clear. So I'll just leave you with this thought. Perhaps the attitude we should take is the one Woody Allen suggests. I'm not afraid of death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. Thanks.